So, with or without a shortage of interceptors and missiles, the United States is not in a uh, good position at all. It's in a very weak position. And the Iranians will continue to strike back at the United States and to punish the United States until they get what they would consider to be a just resolution to this problem, which may or not be anytime soon.
On that note, we're going to turn to our next story, which is the ongoing war on Iran by the US. 2 weeks into Trump's renewed bombing campaign against Iran, and the US still can't win. It can't win on the battlefield, it can't win at the negotiating table, and by the admission of its own military, it cannot bomb its way to the outcome it wants. That's not us saying it, you guys. It's both the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency who've reportedly assessed that the kind of bombing the US is carrying out won't shift Iran's negotiating position. A former Trump appointee who resigned over this war called it, and these are his words, a bombing campaign in search of a strategy. This is what it looks like to kick the can of defeat down the road. Trump paused the intensive campaign after 13 days. Then overnight, the US and Saudi Arabia hit Iran-backed forces in Iraq, killing at least 20 PMF fighters. Iran answered with missiles on a US base and a CENTCOM facility in Jordan. The war isn't ending, it's spreading. And across the region, more and more people are casting Iran's fight as something bigger than Iran, not just a battle for its own survival, but for the sovereignty of West Asia against Western domination. To help us understand where this goes, we're joined from Tehran by Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Mohammad Marandi, welcome back to BT Live.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on, and we're going to jump right into it here because so much has happened since the last time we had you on. And I want to start with the U.S. interceptor issue. The pause in a major U.S. escalation campaign that Trump keeps threatening is being credited partly to the U.S. running low on interceptors. So I'm just curious from your vantage point, how do you see the Iranians reading that? Is Washington being seen as holding off out of strategy, out of necessity, or are some people maybe seeing this as a ruse to catch Iran by surprise?
It is said that there's a major shortage of both interceptors and missiles. And it may be completely true. The Iranians, of course, are not going to carry out their operations based on Western media reports. But we have to go back to the beginning of the war. Back then, there was no shortage of interceptors or missiles in the sense that it is said they are of they're low in numbers today. But back then, the United States still failed in the war. After 39, 40 days of fighting, it was the United States that sought a ceasefire, not the Iranians. And initially, Trump demanded unconditional surrender. And then by day 39, he had accepted Iran's 10-point plan as the framework for negotiations. So with or without a shortage of interceptors and missiles, the United States is not in a good position at all. It's in a very weak position. And the Iranians will continue to strike back at the United States and to punish the United States until they get what they would consider to be a just resolution to this problem, which may or not be anytime soon. We have no idea because, as you said, the United States simply has no policy. And I think your quote was from Joe Kent, who both resigned and he made that comment too more recently. The United States is killing people. It's literally killing kids. Today, a family home on the Qeshm Island was bombed. The parents and a 2-year-old child were killed, and the 2 other children were injured and in hospital, and of course they're orphans now. but your soldiers continue to carry out atrocities against the Iranians in an unprovoked war at the behest of the Israeli regime, and they are driving the global economy towards a cliff because the energy crisis is growing literally by the moment.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Jordan. This round, Iran has concentrated fire on U.S. positions in Jordan. Some analysts have read this as deliberate, saying that Jordan is the last layer of interceptor defense shielding Israel. So hitting that is aimed at Israel's air defenses without striking Israel directly. In your opinion, is that the logic, or is there something else driving this kind of targeting of Jordan?
It is two things. One is it is about the Israeli regime. The Americans have basically created multiple lines of defenses for the Israelis. And all of these bases that we've seen created over the past few decades, they're more about Israel than anything else. And so the Iranians have been systematically destroying them in the Persian Gulf and in northern Iraq. And the only place left were Jordan and Turkey. Turkey, because of the relationship that Iran has with the Turkish government, even though Erdogan continues to transport oil to the Israeli regime and he is close to uh, the Trump regime, the Iranians would prefer not to get into conflict with Turkey. But in the case of Jordan, uh, that it's a different case because airstrikes on Iran are being carried out from that area too. So Iran is striking the radar uh, centers in Jordan, in Western Saudi Arabia. So first they took out they prioritized taking out the defenses in the Persian Gulf region. Then they moved westward into Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and of course, northern Iraq. Those radars have been taken out too, so that next time there's a war between Iran and the Israeli regime, they won't have the capabilities to defend themselves as they do now. But it's also used to hurt the United States because the United States has been using those uh, uh, radar systems and interceptor systems to block Iranian missiles and drones. So it's dual. The policy is for a dual purpose. It's both to fight against the United States and to prepare the grounds for a future conflict with the Israeli regime.
I want to ask you about the Saudi escalation angle of this because, man, have they escalated recently. You know, Saudi Arabia, as you know, just joined the US in striking Iraq and invoking self defense ridiculously, and is reportedly moving to announce, or maybe has already announced, it was the last I checked the news, a multinational coalition on Yemen at the same time. So, you know, you're speaking to us from Tehran. How do you interpret these Saudi moves? What are they actually trying to do? And how does Iran read Riyadh opening two fronts at once?
Well, the Saudis made a very foolish move in that they when Ayatollah Khamenei after his martyrdom, we didn't have a funeral because of the war. So the funeral was just a few weeks ago, and of course millions participated. And for the first time, the West couldn't ignore the reality of the popular support that the Islamic Republic has at home and also abroad in Iraq. So an Iranian plane went to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, brought a delegation. They broke the Saudi siege, an illegal and immoral siege, but they brought the Yemeni delegation for the funeral. And then when they were returning the delegation, and it was a normal Iranian passenger plane with a crew of men and women who are like all other passenger planes. As the plane was approaching the airport, the Saudis bombed the airport. This, of course, outraged Iran, but this was an act of war against Yemen.
Mhm.
And the Yemenis said that we're no longer going to accept this siege, this illegal and immoral siege on the women and children of Yemen. and we're going to retaliate. And so Yemen began to strike back, and the Saudis struck Yemen again, and then Yemen hit the Saudi oil installations pretty hard. So this was provoked by Saudi Arabia, and at a time when the Saudis needed need the Red Sea more than ever before because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Then, after the last operation that Yemen carried out against the Saudis claimed that this was carried out from Iraq. No one in Iraq took responsibility. Yemen openly took responsibility, but the Saudis were insisting that it was not Yemen. And the belief is that the Saudis did not want to directly confront Yemen, so they wanted to take it out on another entity. So the following day, they also claimed that an attack took place, but there's no evidence of any attack. And then they bombed Iraq. They murdered a number of popular mobilization forces, the forces that defeated ISIS, and 5 Iranians who were trainers who worked with them and have been working with them for years. So the Saudi-U.S. coalition, because it was mostly U.S. planes, but the Saudis participated. They murdered Iran. They carried out strikes on the popular mobilization forces, which are part of the armed forces of Iraq. They murdered both Iraqis and Iranians.
Well, Iran, since the beginning, has really framed this war as a war of survival. And across the region, it's increasingly being cast as a fight for the sovereignty of West Asia as a whole against Western domination. And Iran won't surrender. It has continually said it will not surrender. It holds the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. has itself conceded, as we said, that bombing will not force capitulation. So what is the case for, why Iran comes out ahead no matter what the U.S. does?
I think there are a number of reasons. One is, of course, Iran has popular support. We've always been hearing in the West how Iran is a regime, as they love to call it. It's unpopular. People hate it. It's a dictatorship. It's about to implode. It's incapable of self-governance. You have mad mullahs who want to destroy the world. It's collapsing, it's imploding, but simultaneously it's also a growing threat, which doesn't make any sense. And the West really believes their own propaganda, and they use these Iranians from the diaspora who are willing to say what needs to be said for them to get funding, for them to earn their living. And they repeat. They're like the house slaves, as Malcolm X would say, or the brown sahibs. And so this narrative has influenced U.S. policy. And when last year the Zionist regime and the Trump regime carried out the war, the 12-day war against the Iranian people, they thought that a tiny push would bring Iran down like a house of cards. When it didn't work, because the narrative is so powerful, they didn't come to the conclusion that we miscalculated. They thought that, well, all we have to do is bring in more forces. So they brought a much more powerful Air Force capability into the region. The Americans literally brought everything they had. And then they launched the bigger war, the Ramadan War, the war that we're still living through. And still, they were defeated. And that is because the United States simply cannot, and in the West, they cannot comprehend the fact that their assumptions, their stereotypes are false, and that they're just hitting a brick wall. And that's why we saw after 40 days of war, when they had to accept defeat, they imposed siege warfare, hoping that Iranians would starve to death and come to their knees. That didn't work. They had to sign an MOU. And then when Trump was humiliated by the political class in the United States, the elites, he went back to war, hoping that this time around he can defeat Iran. So the mentality hasn't changed. The arrogance of empire is still in place. The second issue is, of course, I think also is linked to Orientalism. The first is partially linked, but the second is, I think, more so in that they underestimated Iran. They believe that Iran is this third-rate country that is incapable of its missiles since they're indigenous. They were created through indigenous technology and through Iranian engineers and the Iranian armed forces were using them, that they must be useless. The Iranian drones are, of course, useless. The underground military bases that the Iranians created, they are a joke. But at the end of the day, when the war began, it was the Americans who were living in the 20th century. Their bases across the Persian Gulf region, in Jordan, in northern Iraq, in the Israeli regime, or at least Israeli bases, they're all out in the open, easy for the Iranians to strike and destroy. And then when the Americans would fire back at the Iranians, they would hit these mountains and do nothing at all, cause literally no damage. So after 40 days of war, we saw that the Iranians were capable of destroying key US assets across the region, whereas the Americans were mostly hitting the decoys that the Iranians would plant here and there. And rarely they would be able to bomb some assets that were being used but Iran's the bulk of its assets are always kept underground. That's why when the Americans say that they destroyed Iranian storages of missiles and storages of Iranian drones, they're always making it up. They're fabricating because all the storages are under mountains. So the sophistication of the Iranian military doctrine, which was far more sophisticated than the US military doctrine, was something that they could not comprehend, that they could not accept. And I think a combination of these two is what led to their defeat.
That is such a diplomatic way of saying that racists can be very stupid. But the point. So the point is a good one. I want to ask you before we let you go here. I want to ask you about the way this war is expanding and the cards that Iran has left to play, because the map of this war we see keeps widening: Iran, Iraq, the Gulf, Jordan, now Yemen.
Ukraine.
So I'm curious what you think. Yeah, well, I was getting to that.
Oh.
I was working up to Ukraine, Zoe.
I'm sorry.
That was the crescendo.
I climbed the escalation ladder, much like Trump.
Well, so yes, that's what I was getting to. I wanted to ask about what cards Iran still has that we haven't seen it play. And that brings me to Ukraine, because there's been reporting from the New York Times that Iran at one point considered retaliating against Ukraine after Ukraine hit Iranian ships. It's, of course, a single-source report and unconfirmed, but if there's anything to it, what would that calculation be about, do you think? And does it tell us anything about how Iran is thinking about the wider board if the U.S. and its allies continue to escalate?
Well, first, I'd like to get to the region, and that is to point out that one other narrative in the West about Iran is Iran and its proxies. And basically, they deny Hezbollah, Ansarullah in Yemen, or the Houthis, as they like to call them in the West, and the Iraqi resistance, as they call them, proxies. Whereas they have agency, they have their own worldview, and that is why on the battlefield they're so effective. If they were simply proxies or mercenaries, at the end of the day, the Americans have much greater firepower. They have more money. They have the Arab family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf with all the oil and gas wealth that could defeat them. But they can't defeat them because these people are highly motivated and because these people have popular support. And so these are not Iranian proxies. These are Iranian allies. And there's a huge difference. That means that Yemen, Iraq, Hezbollah, and the broader resistance in Lebanon, and of course in Palestine, but these primarily these are forces that the Americans simply cannot defeat. And the Americans have already fought against Iran; they've been defeated, and alongside the Israelis. The Americans waged a war against Yemen. They failed. And now you have Yemen and Iran simultaneously actively working to push back against their adversaries. And now the Saudis have, of course, created huge outrage and anger in Iraq. And these are all countries that have large populations. So the Saudis, if they want to build up a coalition, unless they want to bring in mercenaries from Pakistan or from Sudan or somewhere else, which will not be motivated, they have to pick from Qatar with a population of 350,000 and the Emirates with a population of 1.1 million. They don't have the numbers. And in Saudi Arabia, I don't think a lot of people are willing to die for a country that's named after a family. So, and especially the fact is, I mean, it's clear that these countries are all deserts. So they're highly vulnerable. If the Yemeni resistance, if the Iraqi resistance, they retaliate by striking their oil and gas installations or their electrical power plants, these countries collapse. And of course, the same is true with Iran. The Iranians have warned them, in fact, on multiple occasions that if the United States goes after Iranian critical infrastructure, since these countries are assisting the United States in aggression, Iran will strike back at their critical infrastructure. And that would lead to the collapse of these regimes because they're deserts. They have nothing. You know this region. And so Saudi Arabia, which failed in its genocidal war against Yemen, is not really in a position to win this war. Neither is Trump. But we are where we are, and as you both implied, the war is growing. We're seeing escalation and expansion at the same time. And then you have, of course, Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian situation is interesting because initially, when the Ukrainians hit a ship in the Caspian Sea, they claimed it was carrying military hardware. But the people who worked on the ship, it turned out that the ship was privately owned, and the sailors on the ship were smart enough to, well, except for the person who was killed, they were smart and they filmed the attack, and they showed that they were carrying goods that had nothing to do with the military. Initially, Zelensky, the head of Ukraine, can't call him a president because there were no elections, but he justified the attack. And so it seemed that he was attempting to sort of melt the two wars and bring them together, make them one war, the war in Ukraine and the war in West Asia. And since the targeting must have had CIA support, because he does not have those capabilities in his attacks on Russia, and as far as I know, NATO without the CIA doesn't have that ability either. It is believed that the United States was pursuing that policy, and which I think would have been very foolish because it also brings Iran and Russia even closer to each other. But in any case, subsequently, the foreign minister of Ukraine, around the time when Zelensky was meeting Trump, he goes and contacts the Iranians and backs down. And so it's not clear what brought about this change. Was it that the White House did not know what the CIA had done and did not approve, or the White House initially approved of this but later changed its mind? This we don't know. But at least what we are seeing for the time being is the Zelensky regime backing down from its previous position. But the Iranian threat of retaliation is still there. I don't know if it is going to be carried out anytime soon, or in what way it's going to be carried out. But the case is not closed.
Well, we'll have to see where else this expands to next. Trump is incredibly frustrated, as you see, because he just doesn't know. He's like, I don't know how to win this because he can't. We really appreciate you, Professor Mohammad Marandi, for coming on and breaking all this down. Hope to have you back on soon. Thank you so much. Stay safe out there.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope you both stay safe too.